humid stillness of August 30 BC, Alexandria was suffocating under Roman control. But the true battle was not being fought on the streets, but confined to a second-floor palace chamber, a stone cell where the last pharaoh of Egypt was imprisoned. Did she know this room would become her final battlefield? You are asked to imagine not the legend, but the stark architecture of her captivity. A space stripped bare, silent, save for the occasional unsettling movement of a single powerful woman, now entirely powerless. And everything Cleopatra VII had built, her empire, her alliances, her status, had evaporated, leaving only her will in opposition to the colossal, organized ambition of Gaius Octavius Caesar's adopted heir. The chilling silence inside that room was calculated, the quiet anticipation before the psychological siege truly began. A lesson that when empires clash, the greatest struggles are often hidden behind closed doors. The destruction started not with a dramatic assault, but with a symbolic, agonizing ascent. What was the meaning behind this one desperate refusal? When Marcus Antonius, defeated and bleeding, was hauled through the narrow upper opening of Cleopatra's built tomb, his blood marking the walls, the queen defined her immediate terms of surrender. She would not open the main door. That small, terrified, yet determined refusal was the first sign that Octavian's victory would be incomplete unless he engineered her willing compliance. And Antony died in her arms, a Roman victim of Roman ambition, leaving Cleopatra surrounded by treasure, but trapped by the crushing knowledge that the fate of the entire Ptolemaic dynasty rested on her next few hours, demonstrating that even in utter defeat, a ruler's final symbolic act can carry enormous weight. Octavian understood that storming the tomb would grant Cleopatra the very dignity she craved, death in a fortress, death as a queen's. So instead, he employed subtlety and treachery, though he had to ensure one thing. How did Octavian guarantee she remained alive? While she spoke of terms through a narrow aperture, Roman soldiers scaled the structure, entering through the same opening used for Antony's desperate retrieval. The resulting struggle was swift and brutal. Cleopatra, seizing a hidden dagger, instantly restrained, disarmed, and dragged away under the explicit, non-negotiable orders, "Keep her alive." Octavian did not need a dead enemy. He needed a captured spectacle, a living, breathing symbol to be paraded across the empire, establishing a timeless pattern that conquerors often value. The captive's symbolic value more than the battlefield's conquest. To Rome, Octavian had not simply defeated a rival triumvir, he had eliminated the Eastern threat, and this required meticulous propaganda. Why did Octavian have to turn a brilliant diplomat into a cartoon? Cleopatra was a polyglot, politically astute ruler who had negotiated with the most powerful men in the Republic, and that complexity was a problem. Octavian needed to collapse her identity into a singular, digestible narrative. The Oriental temptress, the foreign corruption that almost destroyed Rome, and to justify years of bloody civil war to a wary populace. The rival had to become the caricature, the living Cleopatra. Shackled and humbled in his triumph was the necessary visual proof that the war had been just and Octavian's rule ordained, revealing the historical truth that history's interpretation is always controlled by the victors. The heart of the psychological operation was the complete denial of agency, starting with her future humiliation. How did the Romans use simple measurements as a weapon? Roman triumphs were ritualized destructions of status, ending usually in the strangulation of the vanquished, and Cleopatra had witnessed the fate of Vercingetorix. She knew exactly what awaited her at the Tullianum prison. But to ensure she understood her fate was sealed, Octavian sent not executioners, but architects and surveyors, who arrived with measuring rods and wax tablets, openly discussing the dimensions required for the display she would be a part of, showing that the planning of cruelty can be as effective as the execution of it. Imagine the chilling, mundane cruelty of that scene. Powerful men debating the aesthetics of her humiliation as if she were a piece of furniture for the spectacle. Was this level of cruelty even necessary? This wasn't merely planning. It was conditioning, a deliberate psychological assault designed to dismantle her personhood. They spoke of the chains, the jewelry, the visual impact of her brokenness on the Roman crowd, reducing her to an object to be displayed. Every measurement taken was a reminder that her bodily autonomy, her very existence, now belonged to her conqueror, forcing the idea of suicide to become ever more appealing, a stark demonstration of how total power seeks to deny the humanity of the vanquished. But Octavian needed more than confinement and terror. He needed to reverse her desire for death, and he achieved this by exploiting the one thing she prized above dignity, her children. What was Octavian's most devastating piece of leverage? Separated immediately, Caesarion her son with Julius Caesar, and the 3 younger children with Antony. They became the precise leverage point on the second day of her captivity. The sophisticated diplomat and poet Cornelius Gallus arrived with Octavian's precise, elegantly cruel message. Cooperate and the children live. Die and their safety cannot be guaranteed, particularly Caesarions. An ancient truth that those who seek total control inevitably find and exploit their target's deepest attachments. Caesarion, as Julius Caesar's biological son, was an existential threat to Octavian's legitimacy as the adopted heir, so Cleopatra knew the boy was marked for death. But the possibility that cooperation might spare the younger children, Alexander, Helios, Cleopatra, Selene, and young Ptolemy Philadelphus, created the trap. How could she possibly choose between honor and her children? Octavian forced her into an impossible choice. Surrender her dignity and live, perhaps saving her children, or die with honor, thereby signing their immediate death warrants. The queen was suspended between the moral demands of her royal status and the instinctual demands of motherhood, highlighting the enduring conflict between political duty and personal love. To maximize the pressure, Octavian enforced complete isolation, separating her even from her most loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian. Yet the palace walls, thick stone structures built for protection, now became instruments of torture. What sound was used to break her resolve? Through the narrow window, too small to offer escape, she could sometimes hear the faint sounds of her younger children playing elsewhere in the palace, laughter drifting in, an agonizing reminder of the life she could potentially save. The isolation and the proximity created a state of learned helplessness, making her entirely dependent on her captor's information, which was always filtered, always calculated, showing that sensory details, even joyful ones, can become tools of psychological warfare. By the 7th day, the pressure of the impossible choice had forced a collapse. Cleopatra ceased eating, staring mutely at the stone walls, choosing passive resistance. But Octavian's response was immediate and precise. What was the ultimate emotional turning point? He did not force-feed her. He brought Caesarion. The brief, guarded meeting ended with the 17-year-old boy pleading with his mother to eat, to live, to take care of herself for their sake. And that night, she ate, demonstrating Octavian's total control. The threat to the children was no longer abstract. It had been delivered via the human face of her greatest love and responsibility, confirming that even the strongest will can be undone by the bonds of family. On August 8th, Octavian made his appearance, engaging in the performance personally, and the offer was a masterclass in controlled manipulation and negotiated surrender. What was the catch? To her, dignity. Walk through Rome under her own power, retaining a semblance of dignity in exchange for the lives of her children, a guaranteed future for the younger ones, protection, education, and the clear implication that Caesarion's fate was linked directly to her compliance. She was given 3 days to decide, and this was not an offer of mercy, but an offer of internal justification, convincing her that sacrificing her dignity was in fact an act of supreme sacrifice for her family, a strategy often employed by those in power to make their victims complicit in their own downfall. Octavian's promise was always a lie. Caesarion was simply too dangerous to live, yet for 3 days, Cleopatra lived suspended on the brittle thread of false hope. When did the terrible truth finally emerge? We do not know the precise moment the truth broke through the psychological fog. Perhaps a guard's careless word, perhaps a smuggled note, perhaps the clarity of pure political calculus. But by August 11th, Cleopatra understood cooperation would not save her son. Octavian intended to eliminate Caesarion regardless of her choice, rendering her entire suffering pointless, and the trap had finally failed, proving that ruthless political realities always trump false promises of clemency. With the trap dismantled, Cleopatra moved instantly to reclaim her agency, requesting permission to visit Antony's tomb one final time, a seemingly pious act to honor her dead lover before the journey to Rome. What crucial item did she manage to retrieve? Octavian, confident in his confinement and the effectiveness of his psychological assault, granted the request, and under heavy Roman guard, she performed the required rituals, pouring libations, praying over the place where Antony had died. What the guards failed to see was the small, swift act of retrieval, the palm striking the hidden clay vial, the ancient, potent poison secreted away in the stone for the moment of absolute need, illustrating how the rituals of the defeated can conceal their final end.
Crucial acts of defiance. The popular account of the asp hidden in the figs is therefore likely a deliberate historical misdirection. If it wasn't a snake, what was the real story of her poison? It is far more probable, given the timeline and historical doubts expressed by chroniclers like Strabo, that the poison was already secured. The request for the basket of fresh figs served a single, brilliant purpose: a plausible, natural cover story for the guards to inspect and dismiss. They searched for blades for liquid poisons, missing the real instrument of death already hidden on her person. The snake, whether real or symbolic, was the detail that would be seized upon by the Roman narrative, showing how easy it is for a compelling, simple detail to obscure a complex historical truth. The morning of August 12th brought an unnatural silence to the chamber, and when the guards forced the door, they found Cleopatra dead upon a golden couch, dressed in the royal regalia of the pharaoh she had been so determined to remain. What was the final act of resistance? Her handmaiden, Iris, was dead at her feet. Charmian, still breathing, was using her last strength to straighten the queen's diadem, a final defiant gesture of respect. When the guard demanded if this was well done, Charmian's response was the culmination of the 10-day resistance, extremely well-fitting for a descendant of so many kings, a moment of quiet dignity that defied the Roman expectation of total surrender. This was not a suicide born of despair, but an execution of a final political strategy, because Octavian had stripped her of every choice except one, and she wielded it with devastating precision. What victory did she deny Octavian? Her death in royal attire and on her own terms was her refusal to be the visual proof of Rome's superiority, denying Octavian the central spectacle of his triumph, the living, defeated Queen of Egypt in chains. She chose death to preserve the memory of her kingship over the shame of her human subjugation, a lasting testament to the power of self-determination, even in defeat. Yet, Octavian ultimately won the war of narrative because, unable to parade the real Cleopatra, he substituted her image. How did Rome still manage to stage a defeat? A massive effigy of the queen, complete with the artistic addition of the cobra attached to her arm, was carried through the streets of Rome, and the crowd saw not a complex political enemy, but the simplified, exoticized image of a seductress vanquished by Roman morality. The propaganda worked flawlessly, cementing the fiction of the asp and reducing her final calculated choice to a romantic legend, proving that sometimes controlling the myth is more powerful than controlling the reality. The tragedy was further compounded by the fate of the boy she died trying to protect, for Caesarion was killed 3 weeks later. Was there any doubt about Octavian's ruthlessness? Assassins intercepted him as he fled toward India, and Julius Caesar's only biological son was eliminated at the age of 17, confirming that Octavian's promise was entirely hollow. Cleopatra's death bought only the dignity of its manner, not the life of the successor she risked everything for. A somber reminder that in the arena of empire, a threat is always neutralized, one way or another. The younger children were spared immediate death, but their fate was a different kind of erasure. What became of the survivors? They were paraded in the triumph, replacements for their mother, and then raised in Rome under the watchful eye of Octavian's sister Octavia. They were given education and protection, but they were never allowed to return to Egypt, their royal heritage stripped, their future contained and sterilized by Roman power, serving as living trophies, neutralized as political actors, showing that sometimes survival comes at the cost of identity. The 10 days between capture and death reveal the meticulous architecture of Roman power at its most calculating. Because Octavian did not rely on brute force, he used systemic psychological coercion. How deep did Octavian's strategy go? He sought to dismantle Cleopatra's internal agency, to weaponize her profound love against her instinct for honor, and to construct an impossible choice designed to guarantee her emotional and political defeat. It was a machine calibrated to crush the will before ending the life, an enduring model for how empires seek to control the internal lives of their enemies. Cleopatra's refusal to surrender her final choice, her willingness to sacrifice everything for the denial of her body's humiliation, was her ultimate evasion. What was the true value of her final act? She failed to save her kingdom and her son, but she succeeded in depriving Octavian of the one victory he craved above all others, the visual confirmation that the East had bowed before the West, and she chose the integrity of her death over the preservation of her life in servitude, confirming the timeless understanding that honor can be the last possession an oppressor cannot seize. This account strips away the romance to reveal the true mechanics of ambition and control, and we must remember that Octavian did not need to be physically present in the room to execute the siege. Who were the true architects of her psychological downfall? The process, the measurements, the false promises, the controlled sounds of the children was enacted by subordinates, a perfect bureaucratic cruelty. The power lay not in the individual Roman soldier, but in the systematic framework of the state itself, a chilling demonstration that systemic oppression operates best through impersonal command chains. Stand now in modern Alexandria, the tomb is gone, the palace submerged beneath the waves, and all that remains is the echoing question of those 10 days. What was the unseen price of her defiance? She died a queen, alone in a stone room, succeeding only in controlling the manner of her loss. Her choice was not a victory that saved anything material, but a refusal that redefined the terms of her defeat, proving that the human will can sometimes stand against the organized machine of empire. A powerful, albeit tragic, assertion of selfhood. This video is created for educational and historical purposes, examining themes of power, corruption, and human conflict through analysis and interpretation without depicting graphic events. Because our focus remains on the psychological and systemic mechanisms of domination that shaped ancient civilization, using historical accounts to reveal the sophisticated strategies employed to eliminate threats and consolidate power, grounding this dramatic history in tangible, enduring political science. The lasting victory belonged to the storyteller, Octavian, because he controlled the historical record, ensuring the sensationalized legend of the asp replaced the inconvenient truth of his calculated cruelty. Why did Octavian need to change her suicide into a romantic legend? He needed her death to be seen as the consequence of her exotic recklessness, rather than a final, defiant political act against his ruthless system. That shift from calculated strategy to romantic suicide is the real, enduring legacy of the 10-day siege, showing that narrative control is the final stage of total victory. The truth of Cleopatra's final hours is unsettling because it strips away the comfort of legend, forcing us to confront the limits of human agency against systemic power. What was the only thing Octavian could not claim? She fought brilliantly, maneuvering inside the cage until she found the one spot of weakness in Octavian's armor, her control over her own body. The choice cost her everything, yet it was the only thing left that Octavian could not claim. A timeless reflection on the final sanctuary of personal sovereignty. If this history unsettled you, you're not alone. There is more to uncover about the machinery of power that shaped the ancient world, and you should continue the journey with us to peel back the layers of history
and understand the relentless strategies of empire.